What if I told you that the history you learned in school is missing pieces so important that, if they were fully revealed, they would completely change how you see power, religion, science, and even yourself? And what if I told you those pieces were not lost by accident but hidden on purpose, erased carefully over centuries by people who understood one dangerous truth? Knowledge gives power, and power hates competition, because the biggest cover-up in history is not about one secret or one event. It's about a system, a long, silent operation that decided what humanity is allowed to know and what must stay buried. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Most of it worked. Because right now you are living in a world shaped by decisions made hundreds of years ago, by people you've never heard of. And in the next few minutes you're going to see the pattern they didn't want you to notice. So don't blink, because once you see it, you can unsee it. And let's start with a simple question nobody asks anymore. If history is written by the winners, what happened to the truths written by everyone else? Because when ancient civilizations collapsed, they didn't just lose wars, they lost their voices. And the winners didn't just conquer land, they curated memory, deciding which stories survived and which ones quietly disappeared. And this is where things get strange, because all across the world, from Europe to the Middle East, from Asia to the Americas, we find the same thing repeating again and again. Advanced knowledge appearing far earlier than it should, then suddenly vanishing like someone hit a reset button on human progress. Ancient engineers building structures modern technology still struggles to explain. Astronomers mapping the stars with impossible accuracy. Medical texts describing surgeries centuries ahead of their time. And then, silence. Whole libraries burned. Teachings labeled heretical. Names erased from records. And here's the first twist. This wasn't random chaos. It followed power. Every time knowledge threatened authority, it vanished, because during the medieval period, information was dangerous, books were rare, reading was controlled, and if you knew too much, you didn't get famous, you got punished. And while most people imagine the Middle Ages as a dark, ignorant time, the truth is far more unsettling. It wasn't ignorance, it was enforced ignorance, because behind monastery walls and locked archives, knowledge didn't die. It was hoarded, filtered, edited, and weaponized. And think about this. Why would powerful institutions spend so much effort copying manuscripts by hand, only to destroy others, unless they knew those words mattered? And here comes the next question that should keep you watching. If something was harmless, why hide it? Because harmless ideas don't get burned, dangerous ones do. And this is where the cover-up becomes visible, because again and again, we see the same method. First, label the knowledge as forbidden, then remove it from public access. Then rewrite the story so future generations never know it existed. And centuries later, we call that history. But what if it's actually edited memory? And here's something they don't like to talk about. Many ancient texts describe human potential very differently than modern history does, not as weak, helpless beings waiting to be saved, but as capable, curious, and powerful. And that idea alone threatens any system built on control, because people who believe they are small are easy to rule, but people who know their potential are not. And suddenly you understand why certain discoveries were delayed, why certain inventions appeared late, why progress often feels like it's catching up to something rather than inventing it. Because sometimes we're not discovering new things, we're rediscovering old ones that were buried and buried deep. And now let's talk about erasure, because the most effective cover-ups don't leave obvious holes. They leave replacements, new narratives that feel complete, comfortable, and unquestionable. Stories taught so early that you never think to challenge them. Timelines with clean lines and simple explanations. But real history is messy, and when it gets too messy, someone cleans it up. And one of the biggest red flags is missing centuries. Entire periods where records are thin, contradictory, or strangely uniform, as if written by the same hand. And that's not an accident, because uniform history is controlled history. And here comes another twist. Some of the people who tried to reveal these inconsistencies weren't ignored. They were silenced, scholars accused of heresy, thinkers imprisoned, books banned, not because they were wrong, but because they were asking the wrong questions. And asking questions is always the first step toward losing control. And now ask yourself this: why do modern institutions still argue over access to archives? Why are some documents still classified, still sealed, still too sensitive, hundreds of years later? Because truth doesn't expire, but fear doesn't either. And the fear was never about the past. It was about the future, because whoever controls history controls identity, and whoever controls identity controls behavior. And this brings us to the emotional core of the cover-up. It's not just about hiding facts, it's about shaping belief. Because if you believe humanity has always struggled blindly forward, you accept limits. But if you believe humanity once knew more, built more, understood more, then a dangerous thought appears. What else are we capable of? And that thought is revolutionary, and revolutions always start with information, not weapons. And now we reach the point where the story turns. Because cracks are appearing, lost texts resurfacing, forbidden ideas being discussed openly, technology allowing us to compare sources that were once separated by distance and language, and suddenly patterns emerge. The same symbols across cultures, the same myths hiding the same truths, the same warnings repeated in different words. And here's the reveal they tried to delay but couldn't stop forever. The biggest cover-up in history wasn't about protecting humanity from dangerous knowledge. It was about protecting power from informed humanity. Because once people know their past was edited, they start questioning the present. And when they question the present, control weakens. And that's why this matters right now. Because history is not just behind you. It's shaping every choice you make, every limit you accept, every rule you don't question. And the moment you realize that some of those limits were designed, not natural, the cover-up fails. And the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. Because you see it, you're no longer just watching history. You're stepping outside the version you were given. And that is exactly what they never wanted. And now that you understand how history was edited, the real question becomes even more disturbing. Who benefited from it? Because cover-ups don't exist without profit, and every erased truth leaves someone richer, safer, or more powerful. And when you follow that trail, it always leads to the same place. Control. Because the moment people believe the past was simple, linear, and already fully understood, they stop questioning the present. And that's exactly what powerful systems want. Because questioning creates friction, and friction creates change, and change is dangerous to anyone sitting comfortably at the top. So instead of chains and armies, the most effective prison ever built was invisible, made of stories, textbooks, and carefully selected facts. And here's where the story takes another turn. Many ancient societies did not organize themselves around centralized power, the way we do today. They valued shared knowledge, oral traditions, and collective memory, which made them harder to dominate. Because when knowledge lives in people instead of institutions, it can't be easily confiscated. And that terrified emerging empires, because empires require hierarchy, and hierarchy requires ignorance at the bottom. So slowly, subtly, knowledge was moved from the public into private hands, from open spaces into restricted rooms, from shared wisdom into elite permission. And once that shift happened, the rest was easy, because if you control who learns, you control who leads, and suddenly progress slowed, not because humans became less intelligent, but because intelligence was rationed. And here comes the twist most people miss. The so-called Dark Ages were not dark because humanity forgot how to think. They were dark because thinking without permission became dangerous. And the people who still remembered the old ways had two choices: stay silent or disappear. And many disappeared, their names lost, their ideas stripped of credit, absorbed into institutions that claimed authority while hiding origins. And this is why you often see ancient discoveries credited to much later figures. Not because those later figures were frauds, but because history prefers clean heroes over complex truths, and complexity threatens control. Because complexity invites curiosity, and curiosity leads to questions, and questions are the enemy of absolute authority. And here's something unsettling. Every major leap forward in history happened after access to information expanded: printing presses, translations, public education, the internet. And every time that happened, power structures panicked, predicting chaos, collapse, the end of order. But instead, societies adapted. Because knowledge doesn't destroy civilization, it exposes weak ones. And this pattern tells us something important. The cover-up was never about protecting society. It was about protecting fragile systems built on imbalance. And now think about this. If ancient knowledge was truly primitive or useless, why did rulers fear it? Why did they ban it? Why did they kill over it? Because people don't die for nonsense, they die for ideas that threaten something real. And now let's talk about modern times. Because this isn't just ancient history. The method didn't disappear, it evolved. Today, knowledge isn't burned in bonfires. It's buried in noise, drowned in distraction, hidden behind paywalls, credentials, and endless debate. And that's even more effective, because people feel informed while missing the bigger picture. And that's the most dangerous illusion of all, because when people think they already know the truth, they stop searching, and searching is how cover-ups fail. And here comes another emotional beat. What if some of the limits you believe about yourself, about humanity, about what's possible, were never real limits at all, but inherited assumptions passed down from a time when believing less made someone else stronger? Because belief shapes behavior, and behavior shapes reality, and controlling belief is the highest form of power. And now the story reaches its sharpest edge, because we are living in a moment where the old system is cracking. Information moves faster than control, comparisons are easier, contradictions harder to hide, and suddenly people around the world are noticing the same thing at the same time, that the official story feels incomplete, that pieces don't line up, that too many questions are dismissed instead of answered, and dismissal is always a sign of fear, not confidence, because confident truth welcomes scrutiny, and fragile narratives do not. And this is where the payoff begins to form, because the biggest cover-up in history is not fully exposed by one document or one discovery. It's exposed by pattern recognition, by noticing how often truth is delayed, diluted, or discredited when it challenges authority. And once you see that pattern, you realize something powerful. You don't need permission to question. And the moment people realize that, the cover-up loses its grip, because control only works when people agree not to look. And the truth is not hidden because it's weak, it's hidden because it's strong, and strength spreads. And that's the final twist of part 2. The people who tried to bury the truth unintentionally preserved it, because suppressed knowledge becomes resilient, passed quietly, protected fiercely, waiting for the moment when society is ready to hear it again. And that moment is closer than ever, because history doesn't repeat perfectly, but it rhymes, and every time knowledge breaks free, the world changes. And the real question isn't whether the cover-up existed anymore. The real question is this: now that you know it did, what happens next? And now we arrive at the part of the story that most people never reach, not because it isn't important, but because it's uncomfortable. Because once you understand that history was edited, once you see the patterns of suppression, control, and selective memory, there is one final realization that changes everything. And it starts with a question that sounds simple but isn't. If knowledge was hidden for so long, what were they actually afraid of you discovering? Because it was never just about ancient machines, lost libraries, or forgotten sciences. Those are only surface-level distractions. The real secret sits deeper, quieter, and far more dangerous to power, because many ancient teachings pointed towards something radical: that humans were not meant to be dependent, not spiritually, not intellectually, not even socially. They emphasized self-awareness, inner discipline, and personal responsibility, ideas that make people harder to manipulate, because a person who understands themselves doesn't need constant permission, and that is the core threat. Because systems built on control do not survive populations that think independently, and this explains something strange that happens across cultures. Knowledge about the inner world, the mind, consciousness, and self-mastery is often wrapped in symbolism, hidden in myths, encoded in stories, not because it was mystical nonsense, but because it was dangerous. To speak plainly, and the deeper you look, the more you see that ancient education was not just about building structures or tracking stars. It was about shaping humans who could govern themselves. And that kind of human does not need kings, does not need unquestioned authority, and does not need fear to behave. And here comes the final twist. When that kind of knowledge disappeared, something replaced it. External authority, rigid hierarchy, obedience over understanding, belief without questioning, and slowly, generation by generation, people forgot that another way of being was ever possible. And this is why the biggest cover-up isn't obvious. Because it doesn't scream, it whispers. It lives in assumptions, in phrases like "that's just how it is," or "that's how it's always been," even when it hasn't. And now look at the modern world through this lens. Endless information but little wisdom. Constant connection but shallow understanding. Education focused on memorization instead of insight. Productivity instead of purpose. And suddenly the ancient warnings make sense, because many texts didn't predict the end of the world. They warned about the loss of inner knowledge, about societies that advance technologically while regressing internally. And that is where control becomes effortless. Because confused people look for leaders, insecure people accept limits, and disconnected people are easy to divide. And this is the final reveal. The greatest cover-up in history was not hiding the past. It was disconnecting humans from their own potential. Because once you believe you are incomplete without authority, guidance, or validation from above, you stop trusting your own perception. And the moment that happens, control no longer needs force, it becomes voluntary. And that is why the truth was buried so carefully, not destroyed completely, just fragmented enough that it could survive without being dangerous, waiting for a time when people would asking again. And that time is now, because something is changing. People are questioning narratives, revisiting history, comparing sources, sensing that something doesn't add up. And that instinct is not accidental, it's memory returning. Not memory of facts, but memory of capacity. And here's the most important part. No institution can give that back to you. No document can fully explain it. Because the final piece of the cover-up was always personal. It required you to believe you were small, limited, and dependent. And the moment you stop believing that, the cover-up collapses. Not with noise, but with clarity. And that's why this story doesn't end with a date, a name, or a single discovery. It ends with a choice. Because once you realize history was edited, you can either wait for someone else to tell you what's true, or you can start questioning everything you were handed, not with anger, not with fear, but with curiosity. And curiosity is the one thing no system has ever been able to control for long, because it spreads quietly, it connects dots, and it changes people from the inside out. And that is the truth they never wanted exposed. Not that history was hidden, but that you were always capable of seeing beyond it, once you decided to look.